All right, for the last lecture of this module, we are going to kind of switch gears a little bit, but still staying within the circulatory system realm and talk about the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system can be known as kind of a secondary circulatory system. So whatever fluid and waste and nutrients and things that the circulatory system doesn't pick up, we hope that the lymphatic system will pick up. This is an often looked over system in a lot of A&P courses, mostly because I think instructors find that it's the easiest to skip over. Maybe they don't think it's as important, I don't know. But it's one that I like to actually go over because it has a big role in immunity. So basically what this does, you can remember when we gave the example about edema a couple lectures ago in the blood vessel section, one lecture ago in the blood vessel section. Remember how that hydrostatic pressure in the capillary pushed the fluid out into the surrounding tissue, and then some of that fluid was reabsorbed back into the capillary due to proteins in the capillary drawing that water back in via osmosis. All right, so what happens if that doesn't happen though? What happens if that reabsorption doesn't happen? And then hopefully your lymphatic system will pick up that excess fluid from that edema and deliver it back to your cardiovascular system where it needs to go. So hopefully these guys got your back and they'll take care of it, right? So again, the lymphatic system is a circulatory system. It has a role in fluid balance and blood volume, but it also has a very large immune function, which is what makes it different from the actual blood vascular system. Another interesting thing that it does is absorb dietary fats in the digestive tract. And when we get to digestion, I'll show you what this looks like. But basically, there's a little lymphatic vessel well, not just one, there's millions in the small intestine wall. And those little guys are going to absorb those fats from the foods that you eat. But I'll show you that again when we get to digestive system. But basically this system, this lymphatic system, is composed of lymph, vessels, tissue, and organs. So here's what it looks like if it was all laid out. It's always kind of cool because it looks green. In the body, it's not green. But you've got all these little nodes all over, right? You're all familiar with lymph nodes. So here's these little balls here are lymph nodes. All of these stringy structures are lymphatic vessels. Now, they all flow towards here, the subclavian veins, and that's where they're all going to dump into. So you've got these lymphatic vessels all over the body that are hopefully picking up excess fluid from capillary beds and, excuse me, returning that fluid to the subclavians, which will then drain into eventually the superior vena cava and into the heart here for to be mixed in with the blood. So what is lymph? Lymph is the fluid in a lymphatic capillary. So here is the capillary bed, right? We've seen this already. Now we've intertwined it with lymph vessels, lymphatic capillaries, and they kind of intertwine with this. So let's just say that a bunch of fluid exited this capillary into this cellular space. Well, the lymphatic system can absorb that fluid and then carry it back into circulation if it's not going to be reabsorbed by our regular circulation. And these lymphatic capillaries are closed on one side. So that's interesting. So they're unidirectional. So they always just flow away from the capillary bed. The fluid of lymph is very similar to blood plasma, but it doesn't have the plasma proteins, right? Because the proteins are here in the capillaries. They haven't left. At least not the big ones. And so lymph fluid is very much like plasma, it just doesn't have the proteins. And we want, this happens when filtration is outweighing reabsorption, right? So we filtered out fluid into the space, but we're not reabsorbing as much as we should be. So instead, the lymphatic system is going to pick all that up and then take it back into circulation. So lymph flow is unidirectional, so it's closed on one end and it flows towards the heart or towards the subclavians. Interestingly, it doesn't rely on any pressures other than like your movements. And so the more that you move your body, the more that your skeletal muscles move, your abdominal organs, the more that you breathe, the more that you talk, the more that the fluid can be kind of pushed through those lymphatic vessels in kind of a passive manner, all the way back to your heart. So that's interesting because if the less you move, the more swollen you might get, right? The more the lymphatic capillaries are going to swell, and not get that fluid back to your heart where it needs to go. They have valves to prevent backflow. So they're unidirectional. So they're closed on one end of the capillary bed and you want to only flow this direction. So they have valves to prevent backflow. They also have these little anchoring proteins that anchor them to the cells to keep here's a cell of the tunica interna, or the endothelium. Here's a cell of the endothelium. We always want a little gap between there so that the fluid from the intracellular space can flow into the lymphatic capillaries. So those are little proteins with anchoring filaments. Another function of lymph is that it is involved in the absorption of dietary fats. Again, I'm going to get to this in digestive in more detail, but basically you have a bunch of lymphatic vessels all throughout your small intestine, and they're going to absorb not only interstitial fluid, but also fats. And small proteins that did get into the interstitial space are also reabsorbed back into lymph, back into the bloodstream, which is beneficial, right? So that you're not wasting proteins, they're not hanging out in that interstitial space. And also a more important, I think, function of the lymphatic system is to transport foreign particles to lymph nodes to initiate an immune response in the body in times of infection. So here's what the vessels look like again. So here's the cells of the capillary wall. Notice how they have little gaps between them to allow that fluid that's out here causing edema to move into the lymphatics and travel back to the subclavians, back to the heart. And these capillaries will join up with vessels, which will join up to trunks, which will join up to ducts, and then finally drain into the subclavian veins. And so they have branches of different size vessels, just like with the vascular system. So let's start with capillaries. So here's lymphatic capillaries. They are in the location of capillary beds. They are closed-ended on one end. And the more capillaries here are going to merge into what we call a lymphatic vessel. So multiple capillaries merging together here will drain into what we call a lymphatic vessel. And here's your lymphatic vessels here. So what's not shown here are your capillary beds. They're microscopic, right? But here's what you do see, and you see all these lymphatic vessels traveling this direction towards the heart. Now, your lymphatic vessels, along the way, you may have some lymph nodes here that they're going to pass through. It's kind of just a surveillance mechanism to see if there's any foreign particles, any bacteria, any pathogens in that lymphatic fluid as you're taking it back to the heart, because you don't want to recirculate those pathogens. When the lymphatic vessels lead into a lymph node, we call that an efferent vessel. And once it's passed through this lymph node and then left the lymph node and traveling more on its way, we call that afferent. I'm going to go into that again. And then all of the lymphatic vessels are going to merge into trunks. And all of the trunks here are going to be in kind of this upper portion of the body, usually in the trunk of the body. And so the trunks are divided into 11 trunks. We'll go into those more in detail here. And they drain different regions of the body. So it's just kind of like a bunch of little tributaries draining into larger streams, draining into like a lake, right? And then maybe into the ocean. So you've got lymphatic trunks here. There's 11. Your lumbar, for example, here's your lumbar trunk. It drains all of this stuff, right? Your lower limbs, your pelvic area, your abdominal viscera, things like that. Maybe your jugular trunk up here is going to drain your head and the neck. But ultimately, those are going to drain into one of two collecting ducts. So you only have two collecting ducts, and all of these trunks are going to drain into one of those. One of them is going to be this right lymphatic duct, excuse me, that drains into the right subclavian. One of them is going to be the thoracic duct, which drains into the left subclavian. So those are the only two entry points into the subclavian veins that we have. And those are called collecting ducts. So you have a right lymphatic duct over here, and you have your thoracic duct on your left. And all of those different trunks have drained now into those areas. And then we can enter the subclavian, which will enter the superior vena cava and then into the heart. Notice that your right lymphatic duct drains only this. So it drains the right half of your head and neck, your right thorax, and your right upper appendage. Your thoracic duct drains everything else, your lower limbs, your pelvic cavity, your abdominal cavity, your left upper limb, your left thorax, your left head and neck, lots more. Definitely drains into the left thoracic duct. This little guy here, cisterna chyli, that is where the thoracic duct kind of originates. And so cisterna chyli is kind of the meeting point of all of these trunks down here from the limbs and the pelvic cavity and the abdominal cavity. So it's kind of a little bulge here called cisterna chyli. And that's where everything kind of drains into and then can travel on its way in the thoracic duct up into the subclavian, the left subclavian. Lymphatic tissues, how do they differ from organs? Lymphatic tissues are unencapsulated, so they don't have a connective tissue capsule on the outside of them, whereas organs do. So we call them mucosa associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT for short. These are going to be nodules such as your tonsils, your appendix, and things called Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are located in your small intestine. Those can be very helpful in diagnosing different types of IBS, such as Crohn's disease, which is a disease of the small intestine, autoimmune disease. They'll always look for those Peyer's patches. So lymphatic nodules are unencapsulated, and these would include things like your tonsils, appendix, and Peyer's patches. Everything else is going to be an organ. So all of your lymph nodes, your thymus gland, and your spleen are going to be called lymphatic organs. Here's a lymph node. Vessels leading into the lymph node, okay, running right along with blood vessels, and it's sitting on top of a muscle here. And these nodes are laid out like we saw here. They're all over, right? All of these little dots are all lymph nodes. And leading into a lymph node, so this is like towards the heart, right? If we're going towards the heart, a bunch of vessels, lymphatic vessels might lead to a lymph node, and that lymph is going to enter the lymph node via afferent lymphatic vessels. So you have multiple here, right? So a lot of volume of lymph can enter the lymph node. Now, once it's in the lymph node, it's going to circulate, and you've got a lot of immune cells, such as macrophages and T cells, that are going to kind of survey that lymph, maybe take some foreign matter out of it, kind of phagocytize that, or they're going to stimulate a full body immune response if there's something really bad going on in the body. But notice how you have one exit of that lymph node, and that's called an efferent lymphatic vessel going towards the heart. So the point of this is that a lot of lymph fluid can enter a lymph node quickly, but it doesn't exit as quickly. Benefit to that is that lymphatic fluid is over 90% clean or filtered by the time it goes back into circulation, which is a good thing because we don't want pathogens and foreign material to go back to our heart. Lymph nodes are divided into nodules, little regions here, and out in the cortex or out in the outside of those, nodules are going to be B cells and macrophages. We'll talk more about what B cells are in just a little bit. And then in the center, you've got B cells maturing there. T cells are going to be here in the medulla. So here's the cortex. Here's where all of the B cells are maturing. And then in the medulla here are going to be your T cells. We'll talk about the difference between those in just a little bit. And then the sinuses are just pathways within here that the lymph can travel through so that it gets nice and filtered and then exits via the efferent lymphatic vessel and continues on its path through the trunks into the collecting ducts, and then in the subclavians back to the heart. And that's what this looks like. So we just basically zoomed in on the lymph node, and then I talked about the path through the lymph node. Now, major locations of lymph nodes, ones that you're familiar with, I'm sure, are your cervical, when the doctor feels your lymph nodes to see if you maybe have an infection. The other ones that are very common for that are inguinal, which are going to be in your groin area. Your axillary lymph nodes, we usually associate that with breast cancer. So sometimes those have to be removed along with a breast mass if the cancer is far enough along. Supratrochlear lymph nodes are on the back of the elbow. Pelvic, all these pelvic lymph nodes, all these abdominal lymph nodes, all these thoracic lymph nodes. You've got lymph nodes all over. So functions of them: filtering the particles prior to returning the fluid back to the bloodstream, right? So again, here's all these afferent vessels bringing lymph to a lymph node. Lots of filtering happening here. B cells are out here in the cortex. T cells are here in the medulla. And then one efferent vessel leaving, which means that that fluid is 90 to 99% clean by the time it returns to the bloodstream, which is a good thing. They do a lot of immune surveillance. So not only filtering particles out, but also just checking, if there's no particles, they're just there to check, right? Kind of like TSA at the airport. They're always checking. One organ that we need to talk about is the thymus gland. We've talked about this a little bit in the endocrine section. The thymus gland is located in the mediastinum, which is in the middle of the chest. It is posterior to your sternum or your breastbone, but anterior to your aorta. So it sits right here. Mostly that thymus gland has inactive T lymphocytes ready to go at any time. We'll talk more about what T lymphocytes are in just a little bit, but those are very potent immune cells. And in a fetus, the thymus is a lot bigger. You can imagine that the thymus in a fetus needs to be bigger because their immune system is not as developed as an adult's. And those T cells are those long-lasting immunity cells. In fact, when you get vaccinated, you're stimulating T cells to prepare to encounter that pathogen in the future. And so all these T cells in here are needing to be activated and sorted and differentiated to comprise your immune system. Then as an adult, you don't need as many because it's already been established, right? And so actually in the thymus in an adult is a lot of times it's just fatty tissue. Recall that this endocrine hormone thymosin causes these T lymphocytes to mature. So that stimulates that to happen. Your spleen is your largest lymphatic organ. He's in your left upper quadrant. So if you kind of divide your abdomen in a cross, right, with the belly button being in the point, your left upper quadrant would be where your spleen is located. It's below your diaphragm, lateral, a little bit behind your stomach. It's filled with blood instead of lymph, which is unique. It has something called white pulp and red pulp. The white pulp mostly has lymphocytes or white blood cells. The red pulp has some white blood cells, but it also has red blood cells. Remember that red blood cells only live for 120 days, and your spleen is one of those areas that is responsible for destroying red blood cells that are too old. So that's one function of it. And then also obviously immune function with the macrophages and the lymphocytes that are located there. So when we talk about an immune response, a couple terms that we need to talk about. Pathogen is a disease-causing agent, anything that's kind of foreign. Immunity is the ability of the human body to prevent the entry of pathogens, or if they do enter, they can destroy them effectively. And there's first, second, and third line defenses when we talk about an immune response. And the immune system can be divided up into innate and adaptive systems. So again, this is not an immunology class, so we're going to go into this and just hit the major points of everything, but it is something you kind of need to be aware of. So let's start with innate immunity. Innate immunity, I always think of this as what you're born with. And so these are the things, the barriers that you have in place that you didn't need to adapt over time. They're just there. The thing with innate immunity is that it's a localized response. And so it's going to be a response at the source of wherever this infection's happening, but it's not going to trigger the whole body to respond. Also, the innate immunity doesn't remember any pathogens. And so if it encounters the same pathogen again, it doesn't do anything specific towards that pathogen to prevent it. It's just, again, those barriers that you have in place to keep pathogens out, essentially. And so, for example, mechanical barriers, your skin, that would be an innate immunity organ, right? Mechanical barriers, your mucous membranes. So your respiratory tract is lined with mucus, and we are able to cough out actually a lot of pathogens without them reaching our lungs. Chemical barriers, different pH things, salts, different things that are released by our tissues and our white blood cells, like interferons and interleukins, cytokines, those types of things that trigger a localized immune response. Phagocytosis, we have macrophages that are constantly just eating debris before they're even a problem. And fever is a natural way of our body to basically warm our body temperature to a point that that pathogen can no longer live in our body. It's maybe too warm of an environment. So that's the point of a fever. It is a necessary thing. So when we talk about first line of defense, the first thing a pathogen has to get through is either our skin or our mucous membranes in our throat or our digestive tract or something like that. Let's say it gets past that. Then it's in our body, and now these second line defenses all come in. So now you get a fever and you get some inflammation, and some of these other things are kind of activated to try and stop that pathogen. Then your third line of defense comes in, and this is kind of the queen of all of the defense. So this is going to be your adaptive immunity. So you have all this innate immunity, but this adaptive immunity is how your body has come to be able to initiate immune responses specific to certain pathogens. Memory, right? So this is why vaccination and exposure to pathogens early on in life are so important, because that helps build up our adaptive immunity. If you don't have any adaptive immunity, now you're relying on this. And good luck, right? If you encounter those pathogens again later on, your body's not going to remember them. And each time you get sick is going to be just as bad, if not worse, as the first time you got sick. But if you have this adaptive immunity, now you have the cellular memory and the antibodies and things like that to help recognize that pathogen, to fight it off a lot sooner and a lot quicker. So this relies on identifying cells as self versus non-self. So we constantly have little surveillance cells going around, tagging cells as, yep, you belong to this body, and nope, you don't belong to this body, tagging them for immune response. We're going to talk about cellular versus humoral response as well. So when we talk about cellular or cell-mediated adaptive immunity, this is going to be your T cells. So your T cells are basically, think of them as a king in a castle. And you have your soldiers that are looking around, your kingdom and grabbing people who shouldn't be there, maybe crooks or something like that, right? And they're going to take them to the king, and the king is going to figure out what to do with them. Those little soldiers that take that crook to the king are called antigen presenting cells. Okay, so they're taking this antigen that doesn't belong, grabbing it, taking it to this T cell, presenting it to this T cell. Now this T cell has to decide what it's going to do about it. And they may activate to go and kill every single cell with that antigen on it. They're going to remember that antigen for future. They are going to help antibodies kill that pathogen. There's a lot of different ways. Also, we've got cytokine, interferon, interleukin response. Those types of things cause that inflammation reaction. Also stimulates more T cells to be made to help get these foreign pathogens out as quickly as possible. and initiate a more robust immune response. So if you can think of cellular immunity as the T cells are just taking care of business on their own, mostly on their own, but kind of taking it straight to the king and telling him or letting him decide what he needs to do about it. That's cell mediated, going out and dealing with the individual cell one-on-one. Humoral would be antibody mediated. And this does require the help of T cells, but this is basically making more soldiers. More like they can be antigen presenting cells. B cells can be antigen presenting cells, but they are also antibodies in which they're fighting off. Maybe they're going to fight off the pathogen themselves before taking it to a T cell at all. And that's just helps strengthen that immune response. So you may have B cells producing antibodies, little factories. They're going to produce a bunch of these little antibodies to tag up to antigens and get those cells out as quickly as possible. Then once they tag those foreign cells, it kind of takes the pressure off the antigen presenting cells, because instead of bringing every single prisoner inside the castle to the king, now you're just tagging them, putting a label on them, and as the T cells are migrating around, they can kill you, kill you, kill you, kill you, kill you, instead of bringing them all to the T cell themselves. So they kind of go around and they tag, label foreign cells. That's kind of what B cells do, if you want to think about it that way. And then here's a huge picture from your book that what this all looks like. And so here's your B cells, tagging all these antigens here, making more antibodies, your T cell here, a whole big complicated immune response. Ultimately, what I would like you to know from this is know the difference between innate immunity and adaptive immunity, and then know the difference between cellular immunity and humoral immunity in terms of adaptive immunity. You may have to use your book a little bit on this. That's kind of a skinny version. Your book does go into more detail. I'm just going to caution you. You don't necessarily need to know what all of these different T cells do, all of these pathways. You don't necessarily need to know that either. Just know kind of the major points of what is involved in these different things. So innate immunity, kind of what you're born with. Adaptive immunity is how you acquire your immunity over time. And vaccination is actually a very important part of that. All right, so that wraps up week 4. With that, I hope you all have a great week, and just let me know if you guys have any questions.